Today's game features Mikhail Tal playing as white against Evgeni Ellinovich Sveshnikov as black. Move 1. White pushes the pawn to c4, seizing the initiative. Black pawn to c6, activating the pieces. White responds with develops the knight naturally, preparing to castle. Black continues with advances the pawn, this is the English with b3. On move 5, white controls the center with d4, controlling the center from afar. Moving forward, brings out the knight to f6. At this point, advances the pawn to e3. A solid positional move. Black repositions the bishop. White repositions the bishop. Black bishop captures the bishop on d3. White queen takes bishop. Black advances to e6. White repositions the knight to c3. Continuing, knight hops to d7. A complex position. Move 15. White chooses kingside castling. Black develops the bishop to e7. White advances the pawn. Black pawn strikes, capturing the pawn. White knight takes pawn on e4. Black opts for the short castle. White deploys the bishop to f4. Black now plays pawn moves to c5. White repositions the rook. A subtle improvement. It's black's turn. Queen moves to b6. Move 25. White advances to b3, coordinating for maximum effect. Black moves the rook to d8. Moving forward, white places the knight on c3. Continuing, black pawn takes pawn on d4. White knight snaps up the pawn. Preparing tactical blows. Black now plays brings the knight to c5. At this point, repositions the queen to e2. Black plays rook shifts to d7. It's white's turn. Maneuvers the knight to b5. And here, pushes forward to a6. Consolidating the position. Move 35. White rook snaps up the rook. At this point, black takes the rook with the knight. White finds a better square for the knight, building a space imbalance. Black slides the queen to c6. White knight hops to d4. Black activates the queen, maintaining control. White queen eliminates the queen. Black knight takes the queen. Moving forward, white rook to d1. Black continues with develops the knight to c5. On move 45, white maneuvers the knight to b6. Black activates the knight, a precise technical move. At this point, white knight takes rook. Next, black knight takes rook. White brings the king forward. Black plays knight to c3. Improving piece activity. White advances the pawn. Black activates the knight. White repositions the bishop, a candidate move worth considering. At this point, knight to e4. Restricting the opponent's pieces. Move 55. White bishop slides to e3. Black bishop takes pawn, a sacrifice. White responds with king to e2. So, black brings the knight closer to the action. White pushes forward to f3. Next, black maneuvers the knight to f6, demonstrating endgame mastery. White brings the knight to b6, precise calculation required here. Black develops the knight to d7. White develops the knight to a4. Black deploys the bishop to d6. On move 65, white advances the pawn to g3. And here, black advances to h5. White develops the knight to c2, improving piece activity in the endgame. Black knight jumps to e8, showing excellent endgame understanding. White pawn moves to c5. Black places the bishop on e7. White activates the knight. Moving forward, maneuvers the knight to e5. White places the knight on b6. Black pushes forward to a5. Move 75. White brings the knight to d3, a complex position. Black develops the knight to c6. White repositions the knight to c4. Black repositions the knight to f6. Continuing, white places the knight on e5. Black knight takes knight on e5. White knight removes the knight. Black continues with brings the knight to d5. Meanwhile, repositions the bishop. So, black pawn moves to f6. On move 85, white knight to c4. Black pushes the pawn to a4. White pawn takes pawn. Black develops the knight to c3, checking the king. White king to f1. Black knight takes the pawn. Interestingly, white maneuvers the knight to a5. Black bishop captures pawn, offering material. White knight captures the pawn on b7. Black bishop captures the bishop on f2. Move 95. White king takes bishop. Black responds with the king becomes active. White now plays knight jumps to d6, giving check. A precise technical move. Black activates the king. White develops the knight to e4, the endgame unfolds. It's black's turn. Knight hops to b6. The win is within reach. And here, white king moves to e3. Black responds with places the knight on c4. Checking the king, white plays king to d4. Black continues with brings the knight to d6. We're at move 105. White repositions the knight to c5. Black develops the knight to f5, and check. A forcing move, white brings the king forward. At this point, black moves the king, bringing home the point. White brings the knight to d3. Black now plays pushes to g5. White brings the knight to b4. Black king steps to c5. White places the knight on a6. And that's check. Black moves the king. On move 115, white develops the knight to b8. At this point, black activates the king, the advantage becomes clear. White knight to a6. Putting the king in check. The technique wins the day. Black plays brings the king forward. Interestingly, white repositions the knight to b4. Check. Black plays king to b5. White knight hops to d3. Interestingly, black activates the king, demonstrating endgame mastery. White now plays maneuvers the knight to b2, checking the exposed king. Black now plays steps the king to c3. We're at move 125. White develops the knight to a4, discovering check. Black king marches up the board, converting the advantage methodically. White continues with advances the pawn, an error in judgment. Now, black knight to d6. Putting the king in check. White king marches up the board. Next, black pawn takes pawn, simplifying. White pawn takes the pawn. Black now plays brings the king forward. White brings the knight closer to the action, bringing the pieces to ideal squares. Black plays pushes forward to h4. We're at move 135. White knight captures the pawn on e6. Demonstrating technique. Black king enters the battle. And here, the king becomes active, centralizing the monarch. And here, black brings the knight closer to the action. White knight hops to c5. Moving forward, black activates the knight, and that's check. Now, brings the king forward. Black brings the knight to g4. White plays pushes forward to h3, squeezing the opponent. Meanwhile, black develops the knight to f2, a candidate move worth considering. We're at move 145. White advances the pawn. Black takes the pawn with the knight. White repositions the knight to e4. Black responds with repositions the knight to f4. Mikhail Tal resigns. Evgeni Ellinovich Sveshnikov wins the game.